evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Science Gallery Bengaluru's exhibition season Psyche. For those of you who are new here, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement. And Psyche is our fifth exhibition season, the third which is completely digital and online. Over the past 45 days, Psyche has been unraveling the complexities of the human mind. And today, as a part of our lecture series, we're very pleased to have with us author Jerry Pinto. Before I introduce Jerry to you, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the closing weekend of Psyche. We have a huge number of programs happening. Do join tomorrow for a very interesting walkthrough called Disease to Dish, which is a walkthrough of the labs and clinical spaces where the accelerator program for discovery in brain disorders using stem cells is happening. This walkthrough will be with clinician scientist Biju Vishwanath on Sunday at 2 p.m. India time. Also join us after that for a discussion between filmmaker Alec Widdowson and sociologist Gareth Thomas on Alec's film Music and Clowns, which explores a different narrative around Down syndrome. This is on the 15th of May, Sunday tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. India time. Now I'd like to introduce to you today's evening speaker. Jerry Pinto is a poet, writer, teacher, and editor. His first novel, M and the Big Home, has won multiple awards, including the Wyndham Campbell Award from the Bionic Library, Yale, the Sahitya Academy Award, the Crossword Prize, and the Hindu Lit for Life Award. He is the editor of A Book of Light, When a Loved One Has a Different Mind, and the translator of Swadesh Deepak's I Have Not Seen Mandu, a fractured collage. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jerry. I'd also like to remind the audience that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the lecture, so please add your questions in the Q&A box. And we'll also share a link to our feedback form in the chat box, so do tell us your thoughts about today's program, about the exhibition season, and what you'd like to see from Science Gallery going forward. Now I'd like to hand over to Jerry for the evening.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you for having me, for inviting me here. I just hope that someone will tell me when my time is up, because I tend to talk at length and then I forget time. So just let me know when I'm running out of time. I thought I'd begin with the idea of reading the mind, as in reading things about psychology, reading things about abnormal psychology, reading things about specific mental disorders and specific mental states. And this obviously happened because my mother was bipolar. And the first thing that I think one tries to do is one tries to make sense of what is happening. And what you want to do is reach out and understand what is going on, in the hope that if you understand what is going on, it will become a little easier to bear. Not always so, I have found since. But to that end, I ended up reading a lot of psychological literature. I read everything from the almost, how shall I put it, the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest kind of book, the I Never Promised You a Rose Garden kind of book, The Three Faces of Eve, Flora by, Sybil by Flora Retta Schreiber. All those, sort of madly consumed. And I also read Kraft Ebbinghaus, I read Freud, I read Jung, I read Adler, I read Tarnishes of Wilhelm Reich, even. I read all kinds of things. I was omnivorous. There was kind of urgency about my reading because I was really looking for a cure. I was looking for a way to help. And even in that reading, even in that process, I knew that there was no way in and there was no way out as well. What I was doing was satisfying my need rather than anything else. It was trying to make order out of a disorderly universe. And my sinking feeling, which often came and went, was that all this reading is not going to help. Because one has a very clear notion of what help means. I don't think it was very clear now that I think about it, but in your head there is an idea, a potency, a possibility, a cure. And these are things I think that arrived out of the encounter with popular fiction, popular cinema, where there's a catalytic event, a cathartic moment, and everything is resolved and everyone lives happily ever after. And one wanted to live happily ever after. That did not happen. And I think around the age of 18, I began trying to write down what I was feeling in an attempt to say that once you've written it, you've got some control over it, you externalized it in a certain way, you've set it down. And therefore, again, because words are orderly, words are systematic, words have some inherent logic in them, what you have done is imposed that logic, the logic of language, upon the logic of experience. Now, the logic of experience is not a logic. It is experience. It is anarchic. The same experience can happen to three people. One person can blossom, one person can break, and one person just endures. We don't know why. I suppose we do know why. Science is trying to help us understand serotonin uptake and all the various things that happen in the brain. But always at the back of that, there is the feeling that they're using the brain to understand the brain. And it is not going to be, it's going to take a long time before we actually crack that. Anyway, some people have said that the most complicated thing in the universe is the human brain. So you can only set the human brain to understand the human brain, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to develop algorithms to understand the human brain as well. As if enough computing will help you to understand the uncomputable. Those are the, how shall I put it? Those are the optimisms to which we are prey. So I must have been about 16 or 17 when I started writing the novel that would become M in the Big Room. It was a novel at one point. It was a play at another point. It was a film script at the third point. It was a non-fiction account at a certain point. It was a diary. It was a letter. It was everything. It took on every literary form I could think of until finally, at the age of 40, I decided that I was going to write a novel about my family, but not about my immediate family. The original intention was to write a novel about the bizarreness of the extended family and how strange they were and how funny they were and how odd they were. Now, I believe that we all live with odd and funny families, but some people are much more interested in them and some people are not. And some people tend to be embarrassed by the outlying reaches of the family or the slightly strange members of the family, and so withdraw from them, withdraw even from knowledge about them. I wasn't one of those people. I actively chased up the slightly bizarre characters in the family, engaged with them, was interested in them. And so when I was writing M in the Big Home, I really thought I was writing about them, not about us, not about us four Pintos, not about my mother, not about my family, certainly. And I was a great believer at that time in the rational world of the written word and the desire behind the act of writing. I believed if you wanted to write something, you could write. That words were there to be obedient, to be communicative, to be informative, to be your slaves. You were in charge of them and you told them what to do, and they went out and did their work. That was how my journalism, for instance, was conducted. I had a point of view. I wanted to make that point of view known. It was a point of view which I felt had value in the world, and I was going to write about things. And often I found myself at the end of a piece thinking that that's done now. I've done my work with this one. I knew what I wanted to say, and hey, I've said it. Um, Writing a novel is slightly different. Writing a novel allows you to open up so many possibilities that, and at the same time, close them down. So I always say to my students at Sophia SCM, Social Communication Media, where I've taught for 35 years now, I say the first word that you write closes your options down. Before that, you're standing there and the universe is before you. Why the universe? The multiverse is before you. You want unicorns to be reality? Unicorns can be reality. You want to run time backwards? You can Benjamin Button the whole of your existence. You want to produce places where color does not exist, mass does not exist, gravity does not exist, feel free. And even if you were to simply stick with the quotidian reality of your existence, if you were to even talk about yourself in as solipsistic a way as you wanted to, you'd find there was immense possibility still available until you write the first word. Once you've written the first word, the mind is now working from that first word. You're leaping off that first word. It is now a leap that has certain restrictions on it. If I write I have to have a noun, a verb after it. I do, I walk, I woke up, I did not wake up. If I put a the down, these are the two most common ways of starting, then I have a noun after it. Or maximum, I can have an adjective after it. So I have the boy, or the naughty boy. But still, the means there is a noun coming. Right? So each word then constricts and limits your choices for the next words. Having said that, as you put down the words, you begin to discover that you are also putting in characters, people. Now, the standard orthodoxy almost of all novelists used to be, I mean, my characters got up and walked away from me. My characters told me what they wanted to be doing. My characters rebelled against me. My characters suddenly started speaking in ways that I did not believe. And I would think, give it a rest. I mean, really, seriously, you think a character is rebelling against you, you have to say, and then he died. You killed the character. You've erased him. You've finished his life at that point, and you have had the delight, the vicarious delight of murder without spilling a drop of blood and without ever being hauled up in front of a court and being asked why you wanted to do that, and was there mens rea or anything like that. Very simple. So I didn't quite believe them when they were saying this until I started writing my book about the extended family and found eventually that I had written a book about the four of us, about my mother being bipolar, about living with that bipolar. Then when The Big Home came out, and I remember the night, sort of momentary nightmare a few weeks before it was to come out, when I thought, you've written a book about a Goan Roman Catholic family. It's a very small number of people compared to the enormity of India, compared to the enormity of the world. Why didn't you make them Hindus? Why didn't you make them upper class, middle class Hindus? More relatable, many more readers. But then it was too late to do anything about it. So I let the book alone and I thought, okay, it will find its readers. I found that that the Roman Catholicity or the Goanness of the readers did not matter. Of the characters did not matter with my readers. No one complained about that. No one said anything about it. What mainly seemed to be of interest to them was it real? Now, the answer to that, was it real, there are so many possible ways that you can answer it, so many possible ways that you can fudge it. Okay. That And you can fudge it to great applause, by the way. You can fudge it spiritually, you can fudge it metaphorically, you can fudge it literally. But fundamentally, the central idea was, I think most people are asking, did you live through this? And the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, because my mother was bipolar. No, because this is a novel and this is a book. And I cannot ever shoehorn reality into a novel. You cannot even shoehorn reality into a non-fiction work, because reality is always going to be bigger and more nuanced and more complicated and more various than the words of a book will ever be, however fat the book is. Because the book would have to be the size of the world to incorporate the world. So drop that idea and remember that all writing is an act of choice. There's nothing more than that. There's a choice about what you're going to talk about. There's a choice about how you're going to talk about it and what you will do afterwards. Having settled that, I'd also like to just point out that books can generate books, and this is how. So Emin the Big Boom came out, and I was gratified. I made up my mind. The decision that I made at that point was that I would do what it takes for the book. You know, I I was willing to go and read to small groups. I was willing to go to read to church groups if they wanted. I was willing to read to book clubs. I would I would appear everywhere. Amitav Ghosh at that point told me, I think that it would be 1 year of my life taken away from me because I'd have to just be doing the work for this book, etc., etc. I thought, okay, deal. I don't mind. I've spent 25 years writing this. I can take 1 year to just go out and spread the word about it. But I found that the readings that I did, which were supposed to be pleasant and formal affairs, like, I mean, here is a man in a kurta, and here is the book that he has read, and he's come here, and he's pretending to be talking about the book, but actually what he's doing is saying, buy my book. That's the idea, and please buy multiple copies if you can, give them to your friends as well. If you like me enough, and you like my book enough. That's the idea. I thought this was the civil, polite thing that would happen around the book. And of course, again, life being anarchic, nothing like that happened. It seemed as if readings turned into encounter groups. It seemed as if people were waiting to talk. They weren't just waiting, they needed to talk in some fundamental way. I had a woman stand up in one of the readings and say that she had something to say. So, of course, politely, I said, please tell me. And she said, my brother heard voices. When he was 15, he began to hear voices. And he said that God was talking to him and was instructing him. And we were so horrified by this and so shaken that we locked him in his bedroom for 5 years. And it was only by accident that a friend came over and told them, without being prompted, about how his son was convinced that he was hearing voices of aliens, and that in order not to hear them, he insisted that he wanted to sleep in an aluminium coffin so that he would be able to block the rays by which they were trying to penetrate his brain. And he said, but we took him to a psychiatrist, he's a very good psychiatrist, and he helped him, and now he's fine. He's understood that that moment was, he still thinks he's receiving these things, but he knows, he can see that this is, that thinking that they are aliens or sleeping in an aluminium box is not going to help. Instead of which he talks to his doctor, the medication has changed, and he gets on with his life. He's an engineer, he's doing X, Y, and Z. This seemed familiar to this family, and they went and released the boy from his captivity, took him to the doctor, and he's functional now. But the woman said, and she was in tears as she said it, she said, how do we return his 5 years? How do we give him back his lost time? And I had no idea what to say, except thank her for having shared it, for the honesty with which she shared it, and I told a friend, I said, a female friend, I said, this is releasing energy I'm not equipped to handle. I'm a writer. I'm not a guidance counselor. I'm not an encounter group specialist. Sometimes the energy is so wild and so powerful. I don't know how to handle it. And she said, why don't you tell them to write? It seems to have helped you. So I don't know if it helped me. If at some point, if anyone's interested, I can address that. But I thought, well, that's one way to actually at least bring closure to that moment. To say, why don't you, what a fascinating story. Have you thought about writing about it? It also tends to bring the temperature down from what happened and its savageries and its sadnesses into what can be done. And so that is from a backward looking, it becomes a forward looking, or at least a now looking, so that there is a change in temperature and tonality. It's a very useful suggestion. So I started saying that until one day a woman added a further question. She said, okay, if I write, what will happen to this writing? And there is very little answer to that. I said, maybe we could look at a book. And she said, okay, I'll write and I'll send it to you. And you can tell me if it's bad. I have no problems. So she sent me her piece. Actually, in my head, I thought, yeah, when you sit down to write, you'll actually find that it's work. It's not the pleasurable experience everyone thinks it is. It's actually just, you're like a mason, a kadiya. You're sitting down and a mason puts one brick, next brick, next brick, next brick, next layer of cement. One more brick, one more brick. So like brick after brick after brick after brick. A writer does pretty much that with words, word after word after word after word after word. Except that the mason has the two satisfactions over the writer. The first satisfaction the mason has is he never, generally a good mason doesn't waste bricks. He's not going to, need 100,000 bricks, of which only 1,000 eventually will survive. That's what often happens to a writer. You'll write 100,000 words and find that there are only 10,000 words that can be used. The second uh, advantage that the mason has over the writer is that once the mason has finished his wall, he can hang his plumb line and check. The plumb line hangs true. The wall is good. He can now knock off and say, one more good wall put up, go off and have a drink or whatever, have a cup of tea, relax, his job is done. No writer ever has that satisfaction. No writer ever thinks, I've done all that I could possibly do. You know that there is more that you could do, but you also worry that in the process of doing that more, you might be pecking to death the original intention of what you were writing. So there's a constant negotiation between doing and not doing, doing and not doing. Should I mess with it? Should I not mess with it? Can I do a little more tinkering? Just a little more tinkering, a little more fine tuning, a little more fine tuning until suddenly you kill it. All that is possible, right? And so I thought, the people who said, oh, I'll write, I'm interested in writing, I will do that. I thought they'd come back, or they'd just not come back, they just sit quietly. But the first piece came in within weeks. Suddenly there I was with a piece about someone and her mother, and word began to spread. People, counselors told who were sitting in my events, went and told their clients or the people whom they talked to that, maybe you should write it down, see if it would help. This fellow is doing a book. Go ahead, try it. Out of the book, eventually, towards the end of the book, many of my friends also wrote for it, including a wonderful Punjabi poet called Nirupama Dutt, who also writes in English. Her English is her journalism, her Punjabi is her poetry. Or non-fiction also, I think she's done some non-fiction works recently, on Bant Singh and things like that. So Nirupama rang me up after she'd submitted her piece for the book, and she said, have you heard of Swadesh Deepa? I thought, sounds familiar, but not quite sure. She said Court Martial, and then I remembered Court Martial is a great play. I'd read Nirupama's translation of it in the Little magazine as it happened. And I said, yeah, I thought I read it, seemed testosterone rich, of course, set in the Indian Army, so it's going to be, but it had a very strong subtext of looking at caste in the Indian Army and its practices. So I enjoyed reading the play. She said, do you know what happened to him? So I said, sort of, no, actually, I don't know. And she told me that, he'd had a nervous breakdown. He lost the ability to write for 7 years, tried to kill himself repeatedly. Once he set himself on fire, and having set himself on fire, he was, they couldn't decide whether he went to the psychiatric unit or the burns unit. It was so bad. And then he came out, and his son wanted to write about him, she said. So I said, sure, let me know. I was in the process of wrapping up the book, and I wasn't really keen on another piece. The Book of Light took a huge amount of effort out of me. In the sense, you are dealing with people's most lost moments. They're moments of great sadness. There is a editor from the Northeast who wrote a beautiful piece about confronting the body of her dead daughter, who killed herself out of depression. Another friend who wrote a lovely account of discovering that the person that she was about to marry was schizophrenic. And yet, having received these pieces, I could not treat them as the beautiful, intimate revelations that they were, but I had to look at them as word artifacts. You have to be an editor is to have to be able to say, okay, thanks very much for sending this. Very beautiful. I really loved it. But okay, now let's get to work. We've got to make this more readable than it is. You've got to start working on it. And I thought many of them would just get very angry at the idea. But they didn't. They all responded beautifully to editing, many edits, many iterations of the same piece. And finally, we had come to the end of this whole cycle, and now here's another piece coming in. But I said, okay, it sounds fascinating. Let's wait. And Sukant Deepak, Swadesh Deepak's son, wrote a piece called Papa Elsewhere, which when I read, I realized that he's a writer on the arts in English. So he needed very little editing. He'd done a great job with his piece. The story basically is that Swadesh Deepak, the playwright, recovered, came home, and wrote a book about his experiences as a person who'd had a breakdown and was in a mental hospital. It's called Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha, a book in Hindi. It had come out. But a couple of years after it came out, the symptoms began to recur, and unable to bear them or the effect that they would have on his family, Swadesh Deepak got up, went for his morning walk, and vanished into India. We lost him. We don't know where he is to this day. It was a shocking story, and when I read Sukant's piece, I was glad that it was so well written. It could be sent off. It completed my book in a way that I had not intended. Again, the anarchy of ideas and words, how they will decide to do what they want to do. And I sent the book off, and that seemed to be it. In some part of my head, I registered Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha by Swadesh Deepak as something that I might like to read. But one's TBR list starts with the 13th century, when English started to be written, the 13th century when Marathi started to be written, and continues to today. So there's a lot of reading on that. And then the odd moment, I was helping my friend Shireen Sabawala with Jahangir Sabawala's archive. The painter Jahangir Sabawala had died, and she wanted to present his archive to the museum, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya in Bombay. I was helping her with organizing that and sending it off. And in between all the letters and postcards and playbills and price lists and catalogs and invitation cards, the what is left over from a life, I found a copy of Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha, and I looked on it and I thought, what are you doing here? I mean, this is Jahangir Sabawala. He speaks English beautifully. He speaks French fluently. I don't think he reads Hindi. And then a second later, it clicked. The cover of Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha had a image of a Sabawala painting. Obviously, Swadesh Deepak had asked for permission, and having been given permission, had sent Sabawala a copy of his book. So I picked it up and I asked Shireen if I could borrow it. She said, yes, you must. Please do. On the bus home, I took out a copy of the book because I wanted to read something. I started reading it on the off, and I just fell into the book. It was an amazing read from the beginning because it did not begin in media res. It did not begin in a mental hospital or with a suicide attempt or anything like that. It began with Swadesh Deepak's literary re-entry into polite Delhi literary circles. One night, In the house of Nirmal Verma and Gagan Gill, a party is thrown in which Krishna Sopti is present, Vikas Rai is present, and they're talking literature, history, politics. And for the next 20 pages, that's what you get. A bird's eye view of what it is like to listen to la creme de la creme of Hindi letters talking to each other, which I've always thought would be a fascinating thing to read. I was reading it, and then, of course, this book unraveled, and unraveled is, I think, like I've stumbled on it actually, but it was an unraveling for me and for the book. You begin to discover that this is like nothing you've read before. Nothing. And of course, one has read accounts of people who have suffered from mental illness themselves. There's William Styron's Darkness Visible, beautiful book, perfectly. It's model prose. It is highline. It is resilient. It is flexible. It is steel. It is as if William Styron is telling you, yes, I was depressed. Yes, I was sad. Yes, these things happen, but I'm back and I'm in control of my language again. Not so with Swadesh Deepa. There's a roughness, a tentativeness. There's a undercurrent of unease that runs through Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha. I have not seen Mandu. There is often times when the narration is much more powerful and much more um, convinced of the reality of the madness. It was incredible to read. I finished reading it 2 days later, and I wrote to Sukant Deepak on Facebook. Imagine. That's the connect I had with him. He was on Facebook. I was on Facebook. So on Facebook Messenger, I wrote him and I said, I just finished reading Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha. It's an incredible work. I've read nothing like it. You must translate it. And he wrote back, said, I can't. It's too personal. So without even thinking, I wrote back, then may I? And he could have said, do you know any Hindi? The Roman Catholic Bombay boy. You know what they speak in that city? They don't speak Hindi. They speak their own Bazaru version of the language. He could have said, are you equipped for this? You translate from Marathi as far as I know. Instead of which he said, yes. It was an act of great faith, and I take it as an act of great faith. Over the next 2.5 years, I began to work on Mandu, and I discovered one more interesting and important thing. The real and the fictional in a writer's head are not very separate. Okay? Because if you have to magic up a world, and if you have to populate it with characters, you have to open one section of your head in which this reality is reality. So you're always thinking, would my character do this? Can my character say that? How is my character interacting with everything that's going on around? That's constantly inside your head. What if those divisions break down? Now, when you're reading, I have not seen Mandu. I was also reading this, when I was translating it, I was also reading his short stories, and I discovered that many of his characters from the plays and from the short stories often walked into his reality and talked to him. W.B. Yeats also came in and talked to him one day. W.B. Yeats says that he's in heaven, he's with Hindi writers there, Mukti Bodh, and he's learned Hindi in order to be able to speak to him. So Yeats comes and talks to him in Hindi. These are the possibilities opened by that kind of porosity. So I thought what we needed to do was we needed to translate the plays, we needed to translate the short stories, and we needed to translate this book, and we needed them all to be made available so that if any reader starts with Mandu and wants to know who Maya Bakshi is, who wants to know who Colonel Suraj Singh is, who wants to know what is the Hawa Pad Nahi Sakti, the wind cannot read reference on page whatever, they should be able to do it. So the original idea was that we would bring out the plays and the short stories and the autobiography together, and they would then form a kind of environment in which we could in which Swadesh Deepak could live again in that sense. That didn't happen. We brought out the memoir first, but the other two books are on their way. We're working on them, or it may be one book which contains the plays and the short stories. That's up to in the laps of the publishing gods. I'm telling you all this because it is the way in which things ravel and unravel. Translating Mandu, it was my first Hindi work. It was complicated by two things. One is that Swadesh Deepak himself was an English teacher. He was a teacher of English. Literally, he makes many references to now, anyone who has used a quote ever has that quote because the words of that writer seemed true to your feelings, and therefore you deploy the quote. Why is it that Swadesh Deepak would quote from Sylvia Plath, would quote from Tennyson, would quote from Wordsworth, from Browning, from Eliot, from Shakespeare, and then say that English is the language of lies? How is it even possible? How do you then take a book that has been written in Hindi and translate it into the language of lies? How do you indicate that his elder sister begs him, please don't speak English, Kaka, because then they'll give you shocks. Because when he speaks English, it means that he's raving. It was another question. That there was Punjabi in the book because Swadesh Deepak is a Punjabi man by birth. That there was Urdu in the book. He learned Urdu on his father's behest. That he was an English. These were minor matters. These can be handled with help, right? For the Urdu, for the Punjabi, I turned to Ravi Singh, my editor and publisher, Nirupama Dutt, the poet, and Sukant Deepak. For the Urdu, I turned to my friend Saif Mahmood, who was very sweet with help. It takes a village to do a translation, basically, you can see. And the book's out. In a way, I'm really relieved it's out there. It was a dark time to be doing it, but it was something that I'm really glad I got the opportunity to do. And I think this is such a lovely time if you're a translator because there's low-hanging fruit everywhere. There are books to be done in every language and so few translators. This is about all I wanted to say about reading the mind. If you have questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Thank you, Jerry, for that fascinating insight into your process and how this book, the book and the translation came to be. I'd like to invite our participants to share their questions in the Q&A box. So you can add your questions in the Q&A box and Jerry will be happy to answer them in a minute or so. Maybe while we wait for the participants to start sharing their questions, maybe I could get going with one of the questions that you mentioned. You yourself sort of said that you might touch upon again, which was the idea whether writing about it helped. And I thought that was an interesting point that you left outside. I'd love to hear more about.
Thank you so much for that careful and attentive listening. Always the highest compliment. I think I would like to answer that. Did it help? First, by clarifying what catharsis means. Because people always ask this question and say, "Did you feel catharsis?" And I have to say, okay, technically speaking, catharsis is what Aristotle said. It's the reader would feel. That you create the situation and you present it to the reader, and the reader goes through pity and pain and horror and releases all those emotions. Catharsis is the readers, not the writers. And if you're feeling catharsis, boy, then it's because you're enjoying your writing too much. Just like calm down a bit. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing I think is there's a lot of talk about art as having therapeutic value, and of course, art has therapeutic value. But if you can imagine that art will replace your meds, you can imagine that you can stay up 3 days running, you know, just roiling along happily and ignoring your sleep schedule and eating junk food, not exercising, and you think you're going to end up nice, healthy, and happy after that. No, not going to happen. So I think writing does help. It is beautiful, therapeutic, but it is like the image. I have an image to offer you. I'm a writer. What can I do? The image is, if you've ever been on a long trek with a very heavy knapsack or rucksack on your back, the rucksack begins to cut into your shoulders at some point, like across here. Okay. And then there's a moment when you can't bear it anymore. So you put your thumbs in and pull outwards. And there's a great release underneath that. You feel gorgeous about it. But you also know that at some point your thumbs are going to give in and you're going to let it go back and it's going to rest on some other. You'll probably pull it outwards to rest it on the outer, and it's going to hurt there. So healing is, you cannot trust a single thing, just one thing to heal you. You're going to have to turn towards the light. You're going to have to block off the bad and self-negating thoughts. You're going to have to learn to sleep, to develop a sleep routine. You're going to have to nourish yourself. You're going to have to do self-care. You're going to have to end toxic relationships. You're going to have to cut people out of your life. You're going to have to seek out warm and consoling people. You have to recognize that the warm and consoling person that you sought out turns out to be a toxic person. Then you've got to start all over it again. It's a constant negotiation and a constant encounter. I was going to say battle, but then that's not nice. It's an encounter with yourself. You're encountering yourself on different levels. Once you start down that road, now you're actually, the person you're encountering is yourself. And that person is a moving target. She's changing from day to day. How are we supposed to deal with her? So that's what makes life, I suppose, as humans interesting. I don't know if tigers have this constant worry about these things.
No, I mean, that was a great picture you drew. I could almost feel it as it was happening. There are some comments in the chat. Of course, one of the participants says, thank you for the session. There's another one who's asked if you have any words of advice for aspiring young writers or something that you think they should be reading.
Oh, reading. I think you should be reading omnivorously. And I think you should also be reading, you should be led by your love. Okay. When you're, I was 14, I think, when I joined college. I got to college early in those days. And I remember the feeling of, I was an SSC student, I was a state board student, and there were ICSE students in college. And the ICSE students had read a wonderful Shakespeare play and could quote from it. We had one scene from a Shakespeare play. Okay, that was enough. It was 4 marks, and the teacher said, if you're worried about it, just drop it. Don't worry. Concentrate on 96 marks. That was how SSE taught language at all. So I began to read Shakespeare in manic fashion, and I said, okay, you guys have read one Shakespeare play, I will read all of it. I bored myself silly until my mother pointed out that they're plays, read them aloud. And I began to enjoy them after reading them aloud. But the reason I'm telling you this is not to say I read all Shakespeare. What I'm saying is, we often feel that we have to read things that are of great gravity and of, like, there's Dostoevsky and Camus in our lives, or our lives are meaningless. And it's not true. You will come to, if you read every day. As a writer, you should be reading every day. There's no debate about that. If you're reading every day, today you might be reading Mills and Boon. That's fine. Read lots of Mills and Boon. Enjoy them. You suddenly find yourself reading Georgette Hare.
Mm.
And she's much better as a writer. From Georgette Hare, you suddenly make a shift to Jane Austen. And you'll enjoy Jane Austen as well. And from Jane Austen, you'll go to George Eliot. And George Eliot will whet your senses for A.L. Kennedy or for Margaret Atwood or for who knows. But if you are led by rasa, if you are led by your stern inner teacher who is saying to you, oh, now you must read for your benefit and for your self-improvement, you will make of the glory and the beauty of reading, you will make it into something like a punishment for yourself, an imposition on your life. And don't do that. So I'm saying read from love. Yeah. Read what you want to read. And you will find that you will want to read better and better. It's natural. And it's why we're human. Another reason why we're human is because we're constantly moving upwards, whether we like it or not. Yeah. So that's pretty, yeah.
Thank you, Jerry. There's another really interesting question, and it's from one of our participants who asked, don't you think that the process of writing makes you extremely sensitive towards life and hence makes a writer extremely sad? We've had a lot of examples of writers taking their life. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think, basically in all the creative professions, the poets tend to have the highest rate of suicide, if that's what you're saying. And this seems to be a fact because they're constantly dealing with the inner self and literally mauling it about, mutilating it, changing it, constantly investigating it all the time. So that can be quite dangerous. There is nothing without inherent danger. So I'm saying if you want to be a writer, volenti non fit injuria, as the old Latin maxim goes, which is you cannot want to do it and then say, oh, I can't take the problems that come. You've got to take the problems that come. Okay? That's part of it. Bad reviews are part of it. People saying, yeah, but you're a writer now. If I had time, I would write a novel. Really? You would? Okay, why don't you find some time and write a novel? Like it is, just that much, 5 minutes of work. You're going to have to deal with the fact that people don't really think it's work. That it's kind of like good fun, good time pass you're doing, pastime, whatever. Is the writer sad? I don't think the writer is sad. Is the writer sensitive? I think the best writers are, but not necessarily sensitive to other people. Not necessarily sensitive in the handling of other people. Sensitive in their hand. The best writers are sensitive in the handling of words and imaginary people. They're good at. Okay, so I don't claim any greater psychological acuity on behalf of me or my tribe because we have been dealing with, we've been writers. Everything, including just being a better person or a not sad person, is a combination of biology, biography, and choice. It's all three. You might be biologically predisposed to depression. That's a problem. Your biography may be that you lose a lot of people who've been precious to you. Terrible things happen. That's your biography. And then there is choice. You may choose to look on those, and you may choose, to join a yoga class, to exercise every morning, to greet the rising sun with optimism and say, no, today is going to be better. You may choose not to. You may choose to do alcohol and drugs. So everything is this, I don't know, teen patti between biology, biography, and choice. And writers are not any more different from everybody else. It's just that, as I always say, when someone says, I'm a software engineer, I say, yeah, lots of money, but if something rotten happens to you, you can't write a code and get rid of it. Whereas I can put it in a book. Yeah. Is there a question?
Yes, there are still many more questions. So I'm going to keep sharing them with you. There's a really interesting question from Khyati. So she says that they say that I often write to process my thoughts and find answers that I feel I couldn't have found otherwise. I always get scared of writing because I'm afraid that I'll create a character whom I cannot do justice to. Do you have any advice for this?
I I don't know that you should be scared. I think you should be one of the things that when I think about writing, just like I step back and look at writing, I'm quite in awe of the sheer ridiculousness of the process. Why would you be doing this when there are so many interesting people around you? Why do you want to populate the world with imaginary people? It seems like that. But we've always needed imaginary people. Always. Okay. Whether it's mythology, whether it's fairy tale, whether it's drama, whether it's poetry, whether it's the Lady of Shalott, whether it is, the stories of Akbar and Birbal, who it seemed Akbar only walked about trying to invent problems for Birbal instead of running a whole empire. We need stories in a certain way, so we will tell stories. Khyati, the only thing I can say to you is it's nice to be afraid, but don't let your fear be the engine of your pushing yourself. Don't let your fear be the brakes on your guide. Yeah? Don't let your fear slow you down. I always say the ego, for instance. What is that fear? If you look at that fear is a fear of failure. That fear is a fear that I won't do this well, and I will then look stupid. Right? Now, there are two things about this. Like you can say to yourself, you get up in the morning and the ego makes you get up and brush your teeth and wash your face and comb your hair and present yourself to the world in the best possible manner. That's your ego, your self-image doing its good work for you. But your ego also says to you sometimes, no, Khyati, better not. If you don't tell them you're a poet now, then they won't say read your poems and then they won't laugh. So don't call yourself a poet. Don't tell anybody. Just shut up. Just listen to them and think. You can keep thinking for the rest of your life, I could write better than that. I do write better than that. They call themselves poets. But it's thin broth. It doesn't fill you up. It doesn't sustain you. It doesn't nourish you. So be brave, be bold, be daring. Beautiful lines from Beckett. Yeah. Fail, fail again. Fail better. Chalna karna. Dekhte hain. Who knows, you might not do justice to that character, but who knows, you might.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice for a lot of things many of us might be struggling with and thinking about. There's another question from another artist. Shreyan has asked, how do we get to know what to really write about? There's a lot of things, but I haven't really found my unique voice as an artist yet and don't really feel compelled enough to tell any story yet. How do you know which story you are supposed to tell, and how do you find that sort of truth uh,
Okay.
hiding?
Then I would think first, maybe you're looking away from what you really want to be doing. Okay. Often there are times when people do that because they think, okay, this I could do with less chances of failure, or this I could do because there's more scope here, or this I could do because it's cheaper, or whatever, 100 things that are possible, right? Confront the dream. If the dream is to actually make a multi-million-dollar movie, say that to yourself and start writing that script. Okay. Okay. Maybe it is writing that you want. Maybe it is writing that you want. You haven't found what you want to say. No problem. For 1 year, keep a diary. Just keep a diary. In that diary, what you will do is you will not write down, got up in the morning, had a cup of tea, brushed my teeth. Instead of which you will choose just one event or one person or one thing that happened and narrativize it. Make it into a story. Write it as if it's a novel. Write it from a third person perspective. Get the juices moving. Get the rasa happening and see what comes. Suddenly one day, one of those things might wake up and say, I'm your story. Where have you been? They might not. It might be a long haul. It might be 5 years. No guarantees. No guarantees. But chal, are you willing to take that risk? Tere pe hai. It's up to you, really. Shreyan, I wish I could give you better and more sane advice. But keep asking this question, you'll get lots and lots of different solutions, and maybe one will work for you.
There is another question from Nandan, and they've asked, of course, I mean, you spoke about, it's a sort of follow up from a previous question that came about writers being sensitive. So he says, not just poets, but for mathematicians, issues with the mind are a professional hazard almost. How do you then read their minds? Like, is there any, do you have any thoughts for this question?
I mean, from one point of view, is this is maybe just okay. So suppose you're dealing with a mathematician, or you are a mathematician. Both things are possible. If you're dealing with a mathematician, like most of the time, most people deal with product rather than process, right? So how shall I put it? Let us say you get a gift. Someone has given you a gift. You open the gift and you think, oh, bloody hell, why does this person think I need another mug? How many mugs am I going to have before everyone just discovers that nobody needs another mug? What is it you say? You say, oh, lovely. Thank you so much for this mug. What a beautiful mug. I really like the color. I was just saying to myself, I don't have any mugs all the time. Now, what is your response? Your response is to the product. Just looking at that. But your response, your fake response is also to the process. Oh, this person must have gone out and looked for something to buy me and then not been able to find anything. So he bought a mug. And so, okay, I have to respect that process that he went through. So, okay, I'm going to. Now, your response is a lie. Your response can be even called a hypocrisy, which for some strange reason seems to be worse than lying. Not in any ethical formulation, but in the way we define society, hypocrisy seems to be worse than lies. Okay, anyway, you've lied, you've been a hypocrite, you've stained your moral self in respect of his process, of the gift giver's process. Now, for a mathematician, this just does not compute because they're very used to result. So when you're reading a mathematician, literally what you are reading is the process, the product, and you're not looking at the process and the failure. There's a lot of failure before you have product in mathematics. I mean, for every poem that comes out, there are 500 poems that are stillborn, right? When you're looking at only that one poem, you never see the I wish sometimes people could see process. I wish it was possible to show you all the drafts that a poem goes through. And say, look, this is a goddess or a muse sitting on your tongue and dictating fluently, and you're just writing it down. It's all coming out. It is like kneading dough. And your chapatis, when you start making your pulka, your roti, your chapati, your poli, whatever you want to call it, they're not circular. They're never circular enough. Okay. So I'm saying empathy, sympathy, kindness. All you can use. Tools. The toolkit requires of you your best game. Are you willing? Often not. Often we are judgmental, we are cruel, we are harsh, because that also satisfies something inside us. That's also, people learn to forgive that also in ourselves.
No, thank you, Jerry. This idea that failure and iterations are a part of the process, whether it's in writing or in making art or in science in the lab, it's the same. Everyone sort of goes through it and I guess develops through their unique voice through these failures and sort of growing through it. So I think that's another one to the long list of amazing points you've given for all the aspiring young people here for today's session. So I think this is a really good point for us to wrap up today's lecture. Thank you so much, Jerry, for this amazing the talk you gave to us today. And I'd also like to tell our audience that if you're 15 to 28 and you have more questions and you'd like to talk to Jerry, do join us for the tutorial, which will take place at 8 p.m. That's in half an hour. The team will share the link with you. And also, if you'd love to re-watch this lecture or catch any of our previous lectures that you missed out, you can watch them on our YouTube channel. So we'll be sharing the link in the chat as well. If you enjoyed this talk, do watch a recording of a lecture by historian Geoffrey Room, which is called Mad People's History, which talks about pieces of creative work done by those with mental illness. So that will be an interesting taking off point from here as well. And catch a talk by historian Shruti Kapila on the 2 lives of psychoanalysis in India. So that's another interesting piece. Also, do explore in your words submissions in the perspective section of the exhibition, where young writers from across the world have shared their creative responses to prompts crafted by writer Anmol Tiku around the theme of psyche. You can also check out the exhibit Black Men's Minds by psychologist artist Stephen Rudder, which captures some of the poetry written by Black men section under the Mental Health Act in the UK. So that's a really strong and interesting piece. Again, speaks to some of the stuff Jerry mentioned in his talk today. Again, I'd like to invite the audience to fill in the feedback form, tell us your thoughts about today's talk and the exhibition season and what you'd like to see from Science Gallery going forward. Again, thank you everyone for joining us on a Saturday evening. Thank you so much, Jerry, for being here. It was really fun having you over, and we look forward to working with you again. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. See you soon.